power there. So we kind of run into some issues. All right, so real quick, I'd love to hear what country you guys are from. So if you want to just pop that in the chat, what country are you guys from? I'd love to hear that. It's always cool to see the representation we have all across the world. And the other thing is, I'll be really brief here, is next week or the week after, it'll probably be the week after, but we are launching the Art of E-commerce Debugging course. Super excited about that. Basically, what this is a sample data set. It's probably worth its weight in gold just by that. That is anonymized and it's live, so you'll be able to constantly refresh it really easily. And what it does is it allows you to troubleshoot real-world problems in, honestly, a new code base. It's not just, okay, here's a bug in the Magento core code, which at this point the bugs have gotten progressively more difficult. No, it's here is how you troubleshoot these problems in a new code base using the TAD framework. And there's some interesting bugs. We got 5 bugs started out. I have at least 2 more on the docket ready to go. And I will actually have bounties for people who can help me find additional bugs, etc. It's going to be really, really awesome. So stay tuned for more details about that. Finally, before we jump in to hear what Jesse has to say about PWA Studio, I want to just say thank you. We've just hit 1,500 subscribers on our YouTube channel. I know that comparatively to some of the bigger channels out there, it's like, what's 1,500 subscribers? But it's awesome. It's a lot. And again, my goal is, and what I'm super passionate about, is to help you, everybody, all of you, me too, become better developers. As we have this podcast, Smash the Bug. Jesse's on it sometimes. We have professionals all across the industry. I learned so much. As in our Slack channel, we're almost at 2,000 members on that. Just mind-blowing. I learned so much through that, and my goal is to help everybody, because as we all work together, we're able to solve problems quicker, which means that we're able to get to the help. It makes Magento, our beloved Magento, look all the better. So without further ado, I welcome Jesse here to this conversation. I will change chairs, and I will go over and help out, assist in the background, and he's going to talk to us about PWA Studio.
Awesome. It is so great to be here, and I'm excited about talking about PWA Studio, giving you guys a little bit of a technical intro to PWA Studio. One of the things I'm not going to do is give all the marketing hype about it. I think that there's plenty of places where we can find what that looks like, and honestly, there's a lot going for it. I'm really excited to see what this tool offers for merchants going forwards, and I'll be honest with working on it. I wouldn't say that it's fully production ready. Like, it's not necessarily a Luma theme drop-in replacement or a Huva theme that is just ready to ship, ready to go. But they've made a tremendous amount of progress on it. It's really cool to see that progress, and I think it's getting close to that point at which it is ready to go. And even with that sort of like disclaimer, if you will, it's not that it's not ready at all. It's just that for those people willing to take that step, there will be more investment in these earlier days in developing it. But that's why things like this are more important, because what we want to do is get you up to speed on how it works and give you the tools that you need to be able to start developing with this platform when that opportunity comes. And I think it's going to be around for a long time. I think now is a really good time to learn something like this, because Magento's the one, Adobe is the one that is actually building this. And so it's going to be, I believe, invested in the future and brought to a point of maturity, which means that we'll see adoption rates increasing over time. So I see a lot of benefit for us as developers spending time to learn this tool and understand the way that it works. And I'm impressed with the structure of it. There's a lot of things that I think they've done really well in building it out. And building out an application of this scale is difficult. And there's so many architectural decisions that have to be made. And that is really good. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. Some of the naming, for instance, some of the specific architecture, structure, things like that. But for now, what I want to do is give you a little bit of an overview or introduction to PWA Studio. Some of you might be wondering what it is, and just to kind of get that out of the way, it's basically a React storefront built by Adobe or Magento that is designed to interact with Magento. The great thing about it is that it is platform agnostic. And so they have a spec that they've written called Upward, or they're using, I should say, called Upward, which basically defines a contract of interaction with the backend application. So they're building this as a Magento front end, but it isn't restricted to that, because there's been this decoupling of front end versus back end. So PWA Studio is a theme essentially, but it's built in React. So React.js becomes the primary framework that it is using. It's a more modern approach. So the Luma theme was kind of a collection of JavaScript and some very interesting less compiled into CSS, along with PHP and XML, which, by the way, I think is done very well. Like that PHP and XML part of it is done very well, but the other part of it, the CSS and JavaScript, I think leaves a lot on the table, especially as we're talking about like Require.js and Knockout. Like those technologies aren't very popular for a reason. And they are like for instance, Knockout is inherently slow. Just going through a whole big data set with Knockout, it just struggles. And Require.js doesn't really have handling of like conditional loading, for instance, where you only load a JavaScript file that needs to be loaded. And all of those things have answers for them with things like React.js, which is typically built with Webpack. And so the Webpack tool framework allows for really good control over what assets go to the front end and which ones don't, which is one of the key aspects of what is the PWA seeks to accomplish is performance. That's a problem with the Luma theme. It is slow out of the box. There's tremendous amounts of JavaScript that's loaded that really doesn't do anything. And I think one of the most or one of the more remarkable examples, and that is like the moment library is 60 kilobytes, and it's loaded on, I believe, every page in Magento, and it's used for one type of validation, which is date of birth, which isn't even used on most stores, or I should say a lot of stores. So it's like they're trying to answer that with PWA Studio, which is really good. So by default, these files are served with Node.js, but it can be set up so that way Magento serves the application shell. So that's kind of a break from where Magento is in the past, or right now, where you're going to use something like Nginx or Apache to actually serve the whole set of files that runs the front end. Whereas with PWA Studio, it is more intended to be based off of Node.js. And like I said, there is an adapter, so it can be used on Adobe Commerce Cloud. It can serve those files in that sort of a way, but that is a little bit of a difference there. So you have a new theme that's designed to be run headless, which just means that you have the front end as kind of a separate entity compared to the back end. The reality is, with the API, they're still fairly tightly coupled, but it presents more of a clean break. Right now, there is even a tighter coupling with the Luma theme in Magento. So all of the interactions in that are in PWA Studio are done through the API. There's not really any sense of like providing data to the page in that process. So I want to go over real quick a couple of the tables that Adobe has on their website that show the product availability, the different aspects of Magento that are available in PWA Studio. So the first one here we have, I'm just going to run over these really briefly and point out particularly like the product types that aren't currently supported right now. Like products with custom options, grouped and bundled products are not currently supported in PWA Studio. They will be at some point, probably not too long, because I know that the team is working hard to build some of these features out. But we have a lot that is supported here, like the CMS, for instance. Page Builder has really good support with that. There's a couple things relating to marketing, like email templates, somewhat decent support. And then finally on the checkout, we've got pretty good support through a lot of those things. Payment methods is going to take a little bit more effort to get those set up right now. There's not a whole lot of support for payment methods and the various options that are available there. Don't think that'll be something that we go into today, but that's, I think, a fairly unexplored aspect of PWA Studio. Categories have fairly good support. Shopping carts, good support with coupons and things like that. And then, of course, the customer login and things like that are fairly well supported. So there's still some fairly big areas where there's not that much support, but they're working on those things, and I would say there is a lot there to offer for most storefront. So why would we use PWA Studio? I've mentioned briefly a couple of these things, but again, I think the biggest thing is speed. That's the goal of this, and it provides us tremendous control over what is being shipped to the user when they are loading the page. There's a couple things here that are also that allow us a lot more control, since it is kind of a single page application. We have the ability to have better control over transitions. With Magento, the way it is right now, with the Luma theme, for instance, in the traditional make a request, get the page back, load it, all the CSS and JavaScript, and then display the content to the user, with that sort of approach, we can't do things like expand up. So if we think about being on a category page, we have a product card that has a image and a text and a price, and we click on it. Well, then we get a blank screen and the next screen loads. With PWA Studio, we have more control over that. And we can leave the header and the footer in place as they are. All we need to do is replace the content of, in this case, the category page between the header and the footer. And eventually we can build even more things like a transition and just make that picture, for instance, go bigger, things like that. Those are tools that we will then have available to us with this sort of architecture. So it gives us tremendous control over the entire user experience on the front end, which is something that I find absolutely incredible and I'm excited about. And it's using really modern tools to do all of that. And I personally love working in React. It's a lot of fun to work with. And then the last thing is developer strengths. And this is something that I'm going to be very clear is my opinion. But I think that specialists are valuable. That people who know, for instance, who know React really well, have a place in being able to do well with building applications and architecture and things like that. And in my opinion, being a full stack developer and knowing everything isn't necessarily a benefit. Balanced out with the other aspect that I think that having a broad skill set and understanding is good. But to still be a specialist on things is, I think, a really good thing. And so one of the things that this allows is that sort of segmentation to where we can have React specialists. They don't need to know the Magento backend. They don't need to know those sorts of things in order to be able to develop the React application. And that'll be a downside for some teams, right? It's a new technology. It's a new thing to learn. It is probably going to be a downside for some people, for some teams, but I think it'll be an upside for others. as well. So what we're going to start with here is a little bit on React, because this whole thing is based on React. And so if you want to learn PWA Studio, I think the first thing to do is to learn React. That's an important aspect of this. And there's a lot of places online where you can learn it. Honestly, the React website itself has some really good tutorials where you can go there. There's also reactforbeginners.com is another place that you can go and learn that. So there's a lot of places where you can go to learn what it's like to work in the framework. And I think getting in there and working on it is going to be your best bet. My suggestion is to get outside of your company, of client work, of anything of that nature, and just work on a project yourself. Just think of something to build and build it in React, and create that hello world application, whatever it is, whether it is a checklist or a hello world app or whatever. So just get in there and learn it. I learned Vue.js first, and it's a great framework, and I was really skeptical in moving over to React, but honestly, I like React better. And I say I like it better. It's still pretty much an opinion thing, because there's not a lot about it that I think is actually like quantitatively better. But both are great frameworks, and it's definitely worth learning React. But either framework is really good. But PWA Studio is in React, so learn React. And while I'm not going to go into a full in-depth React course here, perhaps sometime. But for now, what I do want to do is introduce you to some of the concepts that basically come together that I think are most important with React. That way, as we go through the rest of this teaching this class, you can at least recognize some of those things. So I hope to give you kind of a little bit of a crash course in what React is. And so I'm going to pull out 3 elements that I think are particularly important with React. The first one is JSX. If you open up a React component in the PWA Studio, you're probably going to see stuff that looks like somebody didn't know how to write HTML and decided to call it a new name. And it is pretty weird, but I think it's fairly easy to get used to. And what it is it's mixing some JavaScript into HTML. And really, it's not necessarily HTML at all, but it's transformed and transpiled into HTML. So that might be a helpful way to think about it. It's just like a way to build HTML, but it's not like HTML in the first place. And it has some other concepts that are similar to HTML, but distinctly different. One example of that is the onClick attribute. And in HTML, we can do onClick, and that onClick attribute is all lowercase, and we can trigger some JavaScript event on that. In React has its own kind of implementation of it. And so it's a different sort of mechanism. It's not triggering that onClick through that. But what it does is when that element is clicked, then the function that is applied in those curly braces is triggered with the event information or any other bound information that is in there. Actually, let's spend a little bit more time on that slide. Perfect. So props. The next aspect of this is props, and you can see on the slide here, it's pointing to the section of JSX and props. A quick note on JSX, everything inside of that return, so if it returns, it'll return something in parentheses, that is all JSX in there. And again, I'm just scratching the surface on this, so if this doesn't make sense, just try to remember kind of the point of JSX, or in this case, the point of props. So props, the top part of the function may look a little bit familiar to you, but then there's these curly braces, and in this example here, caption, URL. And what we're actually doing is destructuring the props that come into the component. And destructuring basically takes an object and pulls out those keys and makes them into variables themselves. So in this case, we end up with a caption variable and a URL variable. But those were passed in one single object that had a key of caption and a key of URL. It's not necessary to destructure directly in the function declaration. You can do that later, and in fact, often in PWA Studio, Magento does do that. And they'll have props, and then they'll get them other ways. Either way is valid. It's just two different ways to do this, and this is still fairly common. The other thing is hooks. Hooks are a huge part of React. I believe they were introduced in React 16. And they are a part of these functional components, which is basically React used to have a class-based component where we had class component extends React dot component, but now what we do is every component is a function. And the way that we have access to things like lifecycle events and things of that nature is through hooks. And there's some magic that go into them. There's some unique capabilities and everything that are there. But the key thing to remember is that they can only be used in components. So hooks are not some sort of just generic function that can be used anywhere. They can only be used inside of components. And even then, there's some limitations, like they can't be used in loops and things like that. So they have to be called in a specific way, in a specific order. So as you can see here, we have some destructuring on this use state hook, where we have the first item in the array that is returned from the use state hook is loading, and then the second one is set is loading. And this is the way that we have reactive state in React, is by using these hooks. And we set, in this case, we set initial state, and we wouldn't have to default to null or undefined, something falsy like that. And then we have the two, where there's one return value, but it's an array of these two elements. And then we can set it, and we can check it and check the value. And so the whole component will update based off of these values here. So everything is completely reactive. The data is up to date, and everything like that. There's no need to refresh the component manually. Okay, so that's your crash course into React. And is there any questions that we should answer at this point?
One question from Dan. What about Scandia PWA?
Scandia PWA, I'm not familiar with it. Honestly, there's a couple different PWA storefronts out there, like Vue Storefront and several others like that, which are, I'm sure they're good. But in this case, PWA Studio is something that is being developed by Adobe, and that, as far as I can see from the rest of the ecosystem, that means that it's probably here to stay for a really long time. And one of the things that we want to do, at least here at Swift Otter, what we want to do is give our clients reliability. So we don't want to give them experimental technology in the sense of something that might eventually go away. So, all technology will in some sense, but we want to make sure that we evaluate its lifespan and see, is this something that will likely go away? And so I see this kind of like Magento 2 in the earlier days, like 2.0 or 2.1. It's here, it's under development. Is it best for client work right now? That's a decision that is best made between you and your clients, and as long as they understand the additional development cost and the risks associated with it now. But as far as it being abandoned or anything like that, I just don't really see that happening. Obviously, could be wrong, but I don't. And that's I think that key difference as it relates to this class between PWA Studio and some of the other alternates that are out there.
One other question from Dan: are the hooks something like observers as a comparison?
No, I wouldn't compare them to that because they do so much. So in this case, the use state is kind of like an observer, but I find it's more helpful to think about it in terms of the use state hook, in terms of having data that's always up to date. So the component re-renders anytime it's necessary. And the use state is one of many hooks that is available for use in there. There's another one called use effect, which basically responds to lifecycle events. It's kind of like when the component is started up, It'll do something or run the code that's inside of there. When changes are made, depending on the keys that you give it, it'll respond. And so that's another one where it's kind of like an observer in some ways, but I think that that's a little bit more narrow that we want to go. That I think it would be better to think of it in other ways compared to that. Just because React is such a reactive system, there's a lot that just happens for us, and we don't have to think about updating our data as much in a lot of these cases. Great. All right. Awesome. So good. So congratulations on the first crash course in React. And again, just laying groundwork for PWA Studio and what that'll look like. Honestly, if you're familiar with React, I think you'll be able to get into PWA Studio and find your way around it pretty easily with that React sort of groundwork. So for getting started with PWA Studio, they have a really good onboarding experience. So I put up on this slide here, you can see magento.github.io PWA Studio Tutorials has a getting started guide, and they list out every step. I was impressed with how easy it was. I set up Magento 2 fairly early on, 2.0, something like that, and that was an exercise. Getting that thing going, like error after error after error, following the instructions. It's like I was just doing as I was told, but it didn't work. So your experience may be different with PWA Studio, but I was impressed with it. It just run a few commands, and I have the whole thing set up and running. And they even include like a sample data set via a server that they have running. So that way we don't even have to set our own backend up to run with it. I went ahead and changed that out and did set it up, and it was also easy to do. But I had Adobe, I had Magento running on my system that I just pointed it over to there with that, and that was good and easy. So that's what I'm running here. So it's a great place to start. Pull it up, and it is an opinionated way to build your application, and I'm okay with that. Just like React's create React app command, which initializes an opinionated React app, I think it's great to start with this sort of project where you have, hey, this is a structure that you can use. You don't have to, but you can use this particular structure that they've suggested. And I think a lot of React apps that I've seen are kind of structured in a similar way, where you have like a components folder, things like that. And so my assumption going forwards in this class will be that will be your setup. That's the setup that I'm going to use. And again, just from the standpoint, I don't really see a reason to change it. There will be some applications I'm sure that will be different, but that is no problem. And so anyways, as far as getting started, that is the place to go. I want to talk about structure a little bit, folder structure. So when you install this, when you go through this tutorial and set it up, you're going to see a couple key folders in this in your new project. And I think the most important one to pull out is the node modules. It is this gigantic file that has 100, 200, 300 dependencies installed in it. And they're all dependencies and sub-dependencies in a flat sort of flat list of folders. And it's kind of like Composer's vendor. So in regular Magento 2 project, we have vendor folder. Any Composer project, we have that. And so node modules is the alternate to that. And we're going to spend a lot of time as we develop in the ampersand Magento folder of node modules. So that's the second item on my slide here. And that's everything relating to Magento is in that folder. And if anybody ever figures out how to collapse all the rest of those modules so we don't have to scroll through them, please hit me up on Twitter because I'd love to know that. I use PHP Storm, and it's a pain to have to scroll by all of that. But that's the main one that is relevant is that Magento folder. And it contains a number of packages in there that we'll go over here in just a minute. And then locally, we have the SRC folder. When I say locally, that's part of our project. That's the sort of code that we're going to commit to our repository, our Git repository. And that SRC is kind of the main thing that SRC folder, presumably short for source, is the place where we're going to put our components. We're going to put any utilities that we build, things like that. And this is for themes. It's one thing I want to call out here, because the extensions, any extensions that you build, if you're adding functionality, you can build an extension for PWA Studio, and you'll install that into the node modules directory, but it can be anywhere on your file system, anywhere else that you want it to be, or even in the project in a different folder, symlinked into that node modules directory. But for this, we want to focus on changes to the theme. So if we want to, adjust the way that the header looks or something like that, then we're going to put these components inside of the SRC module. And this is similar to the app design vendor theme module folder in a Magento theme. SRC components then is where we'll put our overrides for Venia UI, which is the PWA Studio theme. We'll put our overrides for those components inside of this SRC components. And this has similarities to the node modules Venia UI lib components. And I'm seeing that I have a typo here on the screen. There should be @Magento here between node modules and Venia UI. So inside of that Magento package, there's a number of different folders. One of them is Venia UI, which has lib components, and then there's a list of components. Magento's adopted a fairly flat structure to the components, so it's not like header, account, message. It's just like account link is one of those, I believe in there. There's a number that are just like, it's fairly flat structure. One of the things that I want to mention here is the, actually, could we go back to the previous one? Index.js versus component name.js pattern. This is something that, that you'll see as soon as you open up the project and start getting into this a little bit. You'll see it has a index.js, which imports the component name.js file and basically serves as a pass-through. And I wasn't for sure why this was the case, so I asked on the Magento Slack channel, and it sounds like it's a public versus private type of API. So that way we can, from other components, add the index JS file into our component, but then internally in that folder, we have full control over what component gets served into that JS file. And that makes sense to me. I think that's a good approach. And one thing is, when we're writing in this sort of environment, we don't have to include index.js. So what we do is basically import the folder essentially, and it will automatically pick up that index.js file and give it to us as our component. So that's a nice thing to kind of shorten it up a little bit. It saves a few keystrokes. All right, running the application. This is covered a little bit in the tutorial, but I just want to mention here that Yarn Watch is the main one used for development. I use Yarn. You can use NPM. They're basically synonymous, but it looks like the Adobe team uses Yarn as well. So just wanted to pull out a couple of the things that you might find useful up here. Yarn Start for production. Yarn Build creates a production assembly of those files with things like tree shaking and code bundling and all of those things taken care of. So we have all sorts of different bundles available and things like that. And then Yarn Build Analyze, which I want to show you in this next screen, which I think is a really helpful way to look at the code here. And this is quite a spread of colors and stuff. But what this is doing is showing us the different modules that are taking up size in our application. So we can then use a tool like this to adjust the performance on our application. And one of the things that's not pictured here, but when we do this in the browser, we can hover over each of these packages here, and it will show us the size of the package. So this is just a visualization, but we can drill down into them by clicking the different components to get them bigger, and can see the different libraries that are taking up a lot of space and all of that. And so when it comes to performance, I did want to make a plug for this. It's actually available in most Webpack projects. This is a really nice tool for being able to identify performance bottlenecks. So configuration for the project, the way that works is there's 3 different levels of configuration. The first one is environment variables that are declared on startup, and these would be things like dash, some option. And that's when we're running the command, we specify whatever that value is in that command. The second one is the .env file. This is probably the biggest. And this is where we're going to set things like our backend URL, like where should the storefront make API calls to. It's going to happen in this .env file locally here. And then the last one is defaults from env var definitions. This is something that is part of the PWA build pack. And that is a bunch of defaults. So if we don't declare it in the when running the command, and if we don't declare it during the env, Magento is going to pull a default from this env var definitions.json file. So any changes that we want to make to our environment variables is probably going to happen in this .env file. Let's see. Can I switch over to my screen real quick here, Joseph? Yeah, so this is just a quick peek at what we've got here. And when you pull up the project, you'll see something like this right here, this long URL, and that's pointing to a Magento instance running where you have all your sample data to start off with. But obviously, if you want to do things like add attributes or make other backend changes, experiment with CMS pages, you'll have to have your own store. And so in this case, I swapped it out for a site that's running locally. So bunch of different options right here. Cool. All right, let's go back to our slides and naming. This is one thing that I wanted to cover here because I think it's going to be really important as you start learning PWA to understand this, the names that are used in PWA Studio. And I want to give kudos to the Adobe developers who named these tools. In Magento, we have something called UI components, which include a whole lot of code kind of cobbled together, and it includes Knockout.js, Require.js, jQuery, JSON, XML, and PHP, and that's a UI component. And honestly, the question that I've kind of asked myself, and a lot of people have asked, is like, well, wait a minute, what is a UI component? Because UI stands for user interface. So what it is a user interface component. But I'm like, wait, I just built a application that has nothing to do with Magento. I have user interface components in there. And so it's an ambiguous name. And yet that's what they're called. And so it looks to me like their development team worked hard to avoid that trap. And I think they came up with some great names for things, and have done well with the documentation communicating what those names mean. And I think that's awesome. Names are actually an important part of the way that I do development personally, and just working to think of what can I name something that's unique to this project, that's will describe this, and things like that. So I want to give you an introduction of the names of PWA Studio that you'll know, no doubt become very familiar with in learning it. The first is Venia. This is the PWA Studio theme that's built in React. It's the same concept as the blank theme in Magento. Would be similar to the Luma theme as well in terms of concept. The only thing is that it is the theme to which we would extend from. Peregrine. So this is where the name comes in that I think is pretty cool. Peregrine is a bird. It's a powerful falcon found on most continents. So peregrine are hooks. And mostly it's just a clever name, but hooks are, like in the real world, there's such a thing as hooks. And so peregrines, as a falcon, as a bird, they're going to have claws. They're going to have kind of like hooks. So the peregrine is a collection of custom functions that handle logic for visual components. So they are used to provide information to components, and I would liken them to view models. But generic view models, they're not designed to be tied to a specific component. They are generic, and they are mostly React hooks. Most of them are, not all of them, but a lot of them are. And again, the goal is to separate logic from display. And one of the great things that allows us to do is to extend and change the components that like in our own store, but still use the logic that are there as well. It also allows us to more easily change what is happening inside of those hooks or functions inside of the Peregrine collection because of using something called targets or targetables, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And then the other thing is talons, and these provide logic specific to particular components, Venia UI components. And here I'm using UI components in a very generic sense because they're Venia React components. So you'll have a payment methods component and a use payment methods talon that'll go with that to provide information to that particular component right there. One of the things that I'm going to mention here briefly is that hooks start with the word use. And that's a pattern that you see all across the React ecosystem. So if you see use and then some other words following that, you can know this is a hook. GraphQL is the API data language for fetching and updating and manipulating data, getting it from the server and manipulating it on the server. This is in connection to, or this is in contrast to the REST API, which is an API system where we can make a request and get that data back. The key distinctive between that and GraphQL is that GraphQL allows us to specify what information we want to get from the server in that request. So we're not just hitting an endpoint, we're hitting an endpoint with an object that looks a little bit like JSON, saying, give me this information about customers, or give me this information about products in particular. So we are asking for something in particular and getting something in particular back. Upward stands for Unified Progressive Web App Response Definition. And this is the contract between the front end and the Magento server. So the idea is that we have a contract or a system that allows us to say, okay, this is the way that requests are made to the back end, and this is the way that the back end will respond to the front end. And that's related to this sort of decoupling aspect of making a front end that's kind of a standalone unit. All right, a couple other names would be PWA. We can go to the next slide. PWA build pack. And this is the system and library used for assembling PWA Studio. So, it's an abstraction of Webpack, and it uses Webpack to create those bundles and generate them and prepare them ready to be sent off. Target interception is what I was briefly mentioning, relating to our ability to change Peregrine functions or Talon hooks. And the target interception is similar to mixins in Magento 2 JavaScript, and it allows us to kind of come in after or before or wrap these other functions. And then there's targetables, which are objects that give you access to source code in project or library. Basically, those are places we can hook into, or hook's probably not the best word right there. They're places we can target for manipulating the way that they work. I want to do a slide on a short segment on debugging. Here at SwiftOtter, I think that's kind of rite of passage. That's a big part of the work that we do. And so what I want to do is show you here the way that we can use PHP Storm to debug Node.js. And it's actually remarkably easy to set up. If we go into, let's see, can we share my screen? Perfect. So if we go into package.json here with, let's see, I'm going to actually first show you this right here. So up in the upper right corner, there's kind of a drop down next to the little debugger icon in PHP Storm. What we can do is click the plus right here and add npm to the project, npm debugging. And we can make sure that we want to make sure that our node interpreter is set up correctly, and the package manager is set in my case to yarn. If you use npm, you'd set it to that. And then what we can do in our package.json is click one of these play buttons. And what will happen is we get a little drop down here that says either run it or debug it. And if we click debug it, it starts the process, this tool, with the debugger enabled. And that will allow us to set breakpoints in PHP Storm, just like we would if it was a PHP application, and to debug our way through this. And I found this already very useful for building out targets in targetables and in making those sorts of extensions, which can be a little bit obtuse at first. It can be a little bit difficult to figure out how exactly they're supposed to work, and there's not a tremendous amount of documentation on some of that. So actually getting into the code and seeing the connections between these things is really helpful. So if we go through here, we can see our object and the information that is in it right here. And I'm going to jump in here. And this is another one from Page Builder here, which we won't need right now. But if we notice, it comes right back to our add brand route target, and it's stepping into this. So then we can see what our routes are. And we can then use that information based off and to be able to determine how we hook into that a little bit better and things like that. So on the Node.js side, which is relating to Webpack and building the application and things like that, that is very useful here to be able to debug through that. The other aspect of this that I want to mention is the React side of it. So that's the back end, and then this is the front end. What I'm going to do is play through the rest of this, so that way we have our process running here. I'm going to just make sure that this finishes. So just take a second to finish. And then we'll have this pulled up here, and we'll be able to take a look at the various components right here. So I want to call out a couple different important extensions. And if you don't have them already in Chrome, there's the React DevTools extension, which gives you two different tabs in your DevTools. One is the components, which is immensely useful for being able to identify which components are doing what, and looking through that. That's also an important part of theme modifications, which we'll be getting to fairly soon here. So theme modification requires going through that development stack. So this is useful, and we can select elements just like if we were in the DOM right over here. So can see this, let's see here, coming up to gallery right here, gallery component. That would allow us to know where we would look for those components. Then there's also the profiler here. The other thing I want to show you is Redux. This is a separate extension that you can install, and there's a lot. This tracks all of the actions that are made, mutations that are made. This lets us see the state tree and where that is. Very useful here. So I want to talk about Peregrine just a little bit more, and show you just a little bit what some of that looks like here. So in my project, I have node modules, and under node modules, I have Magento. Just making sure they can see my screen. Perfect. Okay, so under Magento, we have our collection here, Peregrine and lib, and we can see things like hooks, talons, targets, util, things of that nature. So if we just look at a couple of these example hooks, you'll notice that all of these are generic. So use scroll lock, right here. This is something that can be used anywhere. It doesn't matter the component. You can just come into here and grab that. We have used dropdown, a generic hook that we can use in our components for handling dropdowns. If we come down to talents, though, we'll see a little bit of a different picture here. We see talents and then a whole bunch of different folders underneath that. I want to pull up the account menu right here. We have account menu items, and we have a bunch of different logic in here. And that's all that this does, is handle this, this logic. And for a lot of our components, we have the logic in these talents. You'll see them used quite a bit. There's also a couple other things that are used relating to state, which I'm not sure we'll have time to address today, but state is handled through this context folder here in the Peregrine module, and there's a number of different aspects there, but it's an abstraction of a couple of other tools. And then I also mentioned talons already, so we'll go by that one, and we'll go into the Venia theme next. So we're in, again, just to refresh, we're in node modules magenta. You can see at the top of my screen, it gives a clue of where we are at currently in the folder structure. And I'm going to pull up the Venia UI folder next. And under this, we have lib and components. This is going to be the most important folder, or the one that you're most likely to visit. Under components, we have a bunch of different components right here. And we'll just take a look at this account chip since we pulled it up just a moment ago. I first want to note the index versus account chip components right here, which is one of the things I noted earlier. So here we can see the use account chip hook, which is a talent. If we come up here and command click it, I'm on a Mac, it takes us directly over to the talon that we were just looking at here. So Peregrine, lib, talons, account chip, use account chip. So going back to this account chip component right here, I want to just point out the JSX here at the bottom. And this is the way that the Venia theme is put together. A whole bunch of components that are like this. If we scroll down on the right side, we see this long list of folders, and we see things like search bar and text area, text input. Again, those aren't pages. It's not a sort of hierarchical structure that that can be common in a lot of Magento applications. So that's the components. Internationalization, when it comes to translations, we use these dot-based type of signatures, accessing these values in JSON. And I'm going to pull up this account chip again. Oops, not that one, this one. And show you what that looks like. We have this format message here, which is returned from use INTL, which stands for internationalization. And that format message accesses the account chip chip text, which is the one that I've highlighted right here. So that's the connection between the strings that we use inside of our application. So we have to call the hook. We get this function that we then call later for accessing the text inside of that. What I want to do briefly, just in wrapping up here, is to show you the way that we modify the theme. So we're going to actually skip over just a couple of the slides here over to customizing a component. So there we go. All right. So customizing a component, there's information in the tutorial about how to do this. I want to kind of give a picture of what the end result looks like, though. So if we're going to change a link in the footer or something about the footer component, what we have to do is actually copy that and recreate the entire component tree. like ending with that footer. So all the way from the application component down to the footer. This is one of those things that I hope to improve, that I hope they will improve with time. I found it a little bit cumbersome. Like there was a lot of duplicated code just to make some of these changes. And it also introduces some additional upgrade issues in the future, because we have to make sure that all of those components in the chain then are updated. So in this case, if we change a value in our footer component, what we want to do is copy over the footer component and then update any values inside of the head area where we're importing other resources. And we want to update those to point back to the node modules directory where they came from. A lot of them are local in that there. So they're using .. whatever or .. which is a relative or kind of local reference there. And so what we have to do is go through each of those and replace them. After we do that, then we have to go back up to the component that contains, in this case, footer. And we have to update that one as well. And that requires copying it over. And in this case, instead of using the footer component from node modules, we're going to import it right into here. And that's the main change that we make, except that we're going to have to replace this, for instance. So it used to have been something like this is what it would have been originally here. And I'm specifically referring to that header import statement. So then we update those things and work back down to the app and container and adapter and get everything hooked up in that sense. So there's a number of steps in that process. That's one of those places that we can use this React Components dev tool to identify where these values are. So if we come down here, we can see that, you know what? I do that often. I select, these buttons are right next to each other. I don't know if you can see the top left of my screen here, but they are right next to each other. And so I often get the wrong one right there. But if we select the one inside of the component, we see we have the footer component right here. And then we can trace that chain up and replace those different components. So we are out of time, but that is a really initial introduction to PWA Studio. And I hope you found it useful to kind of start to learn some of those terms, kind of see the way that the project structure looks, and some of the ways that you can start modifying these components and changing the theme. And I think you'll find it possible to do that with a remarkable amount of ease, if you will, without much difficulty. So hopefully I've been able to kind of kickstart you in that process. And we'll be turning it back over to you, Joseph. Okay.
Dan again said, how is translation handled in all of this? Is that the international files at the global or per component? Maybe you already answered that. I remember the exact timestamp as far as when that came in.
Yep. No, that's a great question. And it uses the React internationalization package to handle that. And so it's uses those details. And then we include that the internationalization JSON file is what drives then those strings there. So, yep. I'll pull that up while you ask the next question, just to kind of.
That's actually it.
Wait. Okay, great. Let's see, it's already open right here. So again, we're just using React internationalization and that hook right there to format the message. Just like that. So it might be a little bit longer than what you're used to, a little bit more code, but it does work. And the nice thing is it's using very popular tools, like tools that are already built and that a lot of people are familiar with. So cool. I'll turn it back to Joseph.
Well, as someone who is not a front-end developer, I can say that was absolutely freaking awesome. I loved it. It was good. And see what I appreciated about this approach is there was a good amount of code that was shown, but also one of the hardest things about starting out something new is debugging. Like, where do you go? What do you look at? And I really appreciated that. Jesse, let me know if there's any other comments that come in here as we're wrapping this up. But anyways, I want to thank you all for coming. Next month will not be on a Wednesday, so I will put that out there. I'm actually doing some traveling, so I will not be able, unless I wanted to try presenting this in the car as I drive. Not while I'm driving, but I'm sitting in the passenger seat. But I don't think we want to trust the cell phone networks in this country for this type of a presentation. So all that to say, thank you for joining on. And please make sure you subscribe to our Swift Otter channel. It means a lot to us. But also my goal is to help you out, to help you be able to be successful in your endeavor so that you are learning as much as you can. It sounds like we have one more question here.
There is one more question, but I'm going to recommend you post that in Slack.
Okay. If you have other questions, I guess there is one more question. I suggest you post that in our Slack channel. And again, a good reason to join that Slack channel. We're kind of been kicking around doing something really special for our 2,000 member mark. And we're creeping up there. I think we're well over 1,800 now. It's just super excited. It's such a good, vibrant community. And what makes me especially excited about this is you get good advice. Like, there's really sharp people there. It's a community of super sharp people, and you get good advice. So maybe if you could drop that question over there, Jesse will be watching that, and he will have more information for you, be able to help you out with the answers to those questions. So again, thank you for joining us. I definitely appreciate it. I hope that it is a help to you, to your career, an asset to your company, the merchants that you're working with. Again, thank you for joining.